Okay, so get this. The other day, I was like totally convinced, right, that my neighbor was like throwing stuff over the fence, into my yard.
Oh, no.
Like, yeah, some kind of passive aggressive, like feud, starting up.
Oh, wow.
It turns out it was just a branch that had blown off in that windstorm.
Oh.
But like, it really got me thinking about, how often our minds just sort of jump to conclusions
Yeah, absolutely.
based on like incomplete information.
Love to fill in the blanks, right? Our
Right.
brains are pattern-seeking machines.
Exactly.
And that's a lot of what we're going to be diving into today with Don't Believe Everything You Think
Yeah.
by Thomas Kita.
Such a great book. And it's funny because I feel like, it's one of those things that's like so relatable because we've all had those moments where you're like,
Oh.
wait a minute, that was not what I thought it was at all.
We're all guilty of it.
And so this book like really breaks down 6 common thinking errors that we all make. And I'm like, as we go through these, I'm betting that, you and me and everyone listening is going to be like, oh yeah, I do that.
Absolutely. And what I think is so fascinating about Kita's approach is he doesn't just list out the errors.
Yeah.
He explains the psychological mechanisms behind them, like
Right.
why we do these things,
Why are we wired this way?
Exactly. And so hopefully by understanding those patterns, we can become more aware of them and make better decisions.
For sure. For sure. So the first one, and this is something that we've all probably experienced, is this love of a good story.
Uh-huh.
Right? Like we tend to favor narratives over statistics,
Yes.
even if the statistics paint a more accurate picture.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, right?
Yeah.
Humans have been telling stories for, as long as we've been humans.
Right.
And that's how we pass down knowledge and warnings and cultural values.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense that a compelling story is often more persuasive than a bunch of numbers, right? It's like, oh, I can connect with this person. I can see myself in that situation, and therefore
It feels more real.
it feels more real. Yeah, and it's more memorable.
Yes.
You
It's like that example in the book about the Supergrowth mutual fund ad,
Yes.
where it was like this compelling story of this amazing fund manager and, all these returns. And it's like, oh, yeah, sign me up. But then
Yeah.
when you actually look at like the statistical soundness of it, it's like, oh, maybe not so much.
Yeah, it taps into our desire for those easy answers and quick gains,
Right.
It's much more comforting to believe in a brilliant manager than to face the reality of market volatility
Right.
and the role of chance.
Yeah, and I think that's a good takeaway here. It's not to like dismiss stories altogether.
Yeah, right.
I mean, they're powerful for a reason,
Yes.
but it's about being aware
Yeah.
of that persuasive power.
Absolutely.
And, if you're going to make a decision based on something, look for the hard data.
Yes. Always look for the evidence.
Right, exactly. And this kind of leads us into, I think, the second error, which is confirmation bias,
Oh, yeah.
which is our tendency to, favor information that confirms what we already believe.
Yes. One of the most pervasive biases out there.
Oh my gosh, I am so guilty of this one. It's like embarrassing,
We all are.
really.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I feel a little bit better.
It's just our brains, trying to conserve energy, right? It's much easier to just slot something into an existing belief than to have to restructure everything. But this can create echo chambers and prevent us from really seeing the full picture.
It's like when I see, a news article or something that really supports my political view, I'm so much more likely to just like share it without even fact checking it,
Absolutely. And we all do it to some extent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the book has this really great example of a psychic who rationalized away the CIA's decision to stop their remote viewing program
Oh, yeah.
by basically saying, oh, it must work too well, so they shut it down.
Right. Like a classic example of confirmation bias,
Yeah.
because instead of considering other explanations, like, maybe it just didn't work.
Right.
They clung to their belief in psychic phenomena.
Yeah. And so how do we combat this? I mean, it feels like it's almost instinctive to seek out that confirming information.
It is, but we can train ourselves to be more open-minded.
Okay.
One strategy is to actively seek out dissenting viewpoints.
Okay.
So, if you're reading something that supports your view, try to find something that challenges it
Right.
and see how that affects your perspective.
Yeah. And it's like you're intentionally exposing yourself to a different perspective to try to get out of your own little echo chamber.
Exactly. And it can help us avoid another one of these common errors, which is underestimating the role of chance,
Oh, yeah.
which we're going to talk about.
The roulette
The
story
roulette story.
in the book where he thought he had this like foolproof strategy and like lost big time because he didn't, take into account the randomness inherent in the game.
Exactly. Our brains crave those patterns.
Yeah. Yes.
And explanations, even when events are totally random.
Yes.
And we see this in everything from superstitions to, conspiracy theories.
It's like that Sports Illustrated jinx,
Oh, yeah?
where people are like, if you get on the cover, you're going to have bad luck,
Right. Is it a curse or is it just statistics,
Right.
And in reality, those extreme events, both good and bad, are more common than we think.
Yeah.
We tend to focus on the outliers and try to,
Frank.
find meaning in them when sometimes it's just the roll of the dice.
Yeah, so next time I'm looking for a pattern where there might not be one, I'm going to try to remember that roulette story.
That's a good strategy.
And that kind of leads us, I think, to the next one, which is this idea that we actually misperceive the world around us.
Yeah, and this is where we get into some really fascinating territory.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Mm.
Misperceiving the world around us, huh? It sounds a little spooky. Are we getting into paranormal stuff now? Well, it can definitely tie into those beliefs. Kita talks about his own experience of seeing what he thought was a ghost.
Oh, wow.
Which turned out to be a hallucination.
Really?
And this really gets to the heart of how our brains process information and how sometimes that processing can go a little haywire.
So it's not just that we misinterpret things that are there,
Yeah.
but we actually perceive things that aren't really there.
Exactly. And hallucinations are way more common than people realize. I mean, they can be triggered by all sorts of things like stress, sleep deprivation, even certain medications.
Wow. It makes you wonder how much of what we think is reality is actually just our brain filling in the gaps.
That's a really key point, right? Because our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world, and sometimes that means creating patterns where none exist or even perceiving things that aren't actually there.
Like those images where people see the Virgin Mary in a piece of toast.
Exactly. Or those blurry photos of Bigfoot that always turn out to be a bear or a guy in a suit.
Right.
It's like our brains are wired to look for those patterns and make connections even when the evidence is super flimsy.
Yeah.
And, this tendency to misperceive can have some real-world consequences, especially when it comes to things like eyewitness testimony.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
If our memories and perceptions are so easily influenced,
Yeah.
I mean, it really makes you question the reliability of eyewitness accounts in, criminal cases.
Absolutely. And this ties into another one of the thinking errors that Kita explores, which is this tendency to oversimplify.
Okay.
Right? We tend to reduce these complex issues down to really simple explanations, and that can lead to some flawed judgments.
I see this all the time in political debates where
Yeah.
people try to fit these really complicated social problems into these neat little boxes with easy solutions.
Right. And it's totally understandable because as humans, we crave that clarity and certainty.
Right.
But the reality is that most issues are multifaceted and nuanced.
Right.
And one example that Kita uses is this thing called the representativeness heuristic, which is basically how we judge things based on how similar they are to a prototype in our minds.
Can you give a real world example of that?
Yeah, so imagine you're told about a person who's really into math and science and then asked to guess if they're a computer science major or a humanities major.
I'd probably say computer science
Yeah.
just because it fits the stereotype.
Right, exactly. And that's the representativeness heuristic in action, but it ignores what's called the base rate, which
Okay.
is how many humanities majors there are compared to computer science majors.
Huh.
There might be way more humanities students overall.
Right. So we get blinded by the stereotype and forget to consider the bigger picture.
Exactly. And Gaia also talks about this thing called mental accounting bias, which explains why we might drive across town to save $25 on a $50 purchase, but not for a $500 purchase.
It doesn't make logical sense, but it feels like a bigger deal to save a larger percentage, even though it's the same amount of money.
Precisely, our brains don't always follow the rules of logic and reason. And this brings us to another area where our thinking can really go astray, our faulty memories.
Ooh, this one always kind of freaks me out a little. The idea that our memories aren't as reliable as we think they are is kind of unsettling.
It is. And Kita talks about cases where people have literally had memories implanted, leading them to believe things that never actually happened.
I remember reading about that experiment where people were shown a video of a car accident and then asked to estimate the speed of the cars.
Oh, yeah.
And the people who were asked using the word smashed were more likely to remember seeing broken glass even though there wasn't any.
Right. That study just shows how easily our memories can be manipulated by suggestion and leading questions. Our memories aren't like video recordings. They're constantly being reconstructed and reinterpreted.
So how do we guard against those memory distortions?
Mhm.
It feels like we're kind of at the mercy of our own brains.
Well, while we can't totally eliminate the potential for error, We can be more mindful of the factors that influence our memories, like try to avoid leading questions when discussing an event with someone. And be aware that your own emotions and biases can color your recollections.
So basically, be skeptical of any memory that's super vivid or emotionally charged.
That's a good starting point. And this leads us to the question of how we can safeguard ourselves against these thinking errors in general. And one of the most powerful tools we have is science.
Science. How does that relate to all of this?
Well, at its core, science is a method for testing our beliefs and minimizing the influence of our biases.
Yeah.
It's a system based on evidence, observation, and rigorous testing.
So instead of just accepting things at face value, we should demand evidence and look for studies that have been replicated and peer-reviewed.
Exactly. And remember, science is constantly evolving and self-correcting. When new evidence emerges, scientific theories are updated or even discarded.
Right.
And this is in stark contrast to pseudoscience, which often clings to beliefs even when they've been debunked.
Like the belief in facilitated communication, where people thought they were helping autistic children communicate, but it turned out they were unconsciously doing the typing themselves.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Facilitated communication seemed like a miracle, but controlled studies revealed the truth. And that's the power of the scientific method. It helps us separate fact from fiction even when the fiction is more appealing.
So science can help us avoid being fooled by our own biases and wishful thinking.
Absolutely. And it can also help us understand how the media can influence our perceptions and beliefs.
That's a really good point. I've definitely noticed how the media tends to focus on the sensational and the unusual, which can distort our sense of risk and probability.
It's all about ratings and clicks, right? The more shocking or dramatic a story is, the more likely it is to get attention.
Right.
But this can lead us to overestimate the likelihood of rare events like shark attacks and underestimate the risks of more common dangers.
Like driving while texting, which is statistically way more dangerous than being eaten by a shark.
Exactly, and it's not just about the types of stories that are covered, but also how they're framed.
Okay.
The media can use language and imagery to evoke strong emotions and really shape public opinion.
Like that case where a news station staged a crack cocaine purchase near the White House to try to fuel the war on drugs narrative. It was completely fabricated, but it had a huge impact on policy decisions.
That's a powerful example of how easily we can be manipulated by media narratives, especially when they play on our fears and biases.
Wow.
So it's crucial to be media literate, to question the information we're being fed, and to consider the source and their potential motives.
So how do we become more discerning consumers of information in a world that's just like saturated with media?
One strategy is to diversify your news sources.
Yeah.
Don't just rely on one website or cable channel. Seek out information from a variety of perspectives, including those that challenge your own views.
Okay.
And be aware of the techniques that the media uses to try to grab your attention and influence your emotions. Pay attention to the language, the imagery, the way the story is framed. Ask yourself, are they appealing to my fears or biases? Are they presenting a balanced view of the issue?
It sounds like being a critical thinker requires a lot of effort and vigilance.
It does, but the rewards are so worth it.
Yeah.
By understanding the pitfalls of our own thinking and the ways in which we can be influenced, we can become more informed, more rational, and more empowered decision makers.
So it's like we need this mental toolkit,
Yeah.
to navigate all this information and misinformation out there. Are there any other key takeaways from the book that we haven't really touched on yet?
Well, we were talking earlier about, how these compelling narratives can often overshadow hard data.
Yeah, like that super growth mutual fund ad.
Exactly.
It was a good story, but maybe not a good investment.
Right. And Keto brings up another example that I think really highlights the danger of relying too heavily on anecdotes.
Okay.
He discusses this wave of lawsuits against silicone breast implant manufacturers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I vaguely remember hearing about that. People were claiming that the implants were causing all sorts of health problems.
It was a very emotionally charged issue.
Right.
Women were suffering from these serious illnesses, and they believed that the implants were to blame. It's understandable why that narrative took hold.
Yeah, but what did the scientific evidence actually show?
Well, when researchers conducted these really rigorous studies, controlling for other factors and using large sample sizes, they found no link between silicone breast implants and the diseases that were being reported.
So it was a case of correlation being mistaken for causation.
Exactly. Just because some women with implants got sick didn't mean that the implants were the cause.
Right.
And this is where the scientific method is so important.
Yeah.
It's designed to help us distinguish between genuine connections and just coincidental occurrences.
It's like that experiment where they gave people decaf coffee, but told them it was regular.
Oh, yeah.
and they still experienced like the jitters and the alertness just because of their expectations.
The placebo effect in
Yeah.
action. And it just highlights the need for control groups in these studies. We need to compare those who received the treatment to those who didn't in order to really isolate the true effect.
So it's not enough to just look for confirming evidence.
No.
We have to actively look for disconfirming evidence as well.
That's a huge part of critical thinking.
Right?
We need to consider alternative explanations and be willing to change our minds when presented with new information.
It sounds like a lot of these thinking errors stem from our desire for like simple answers and our tendency to jump to conclusions.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. We crave certainty and meaning, and sometimes that leads us to overlook complexity and nuance.
Like with that whole debate about sugar and hyperactivity in kids.
Oh, yeah.
It seems so obvious that sugar would make kids bounce off the walls, but the research doesn't really back that up.
Right. We focus on the instances where it seems true and ignore all the times when kids are hyper without having had sugar.
Or when they have sugar and they don't get hyper.
Right, exactly. It's like we create these mental shortcuts that simplify the world but also lead to inaccurate conclusions.
And those shortcuts can be really hard to break. Even when we're aware of them, we still fall prey to them.
It's a constant battle.
So that's the antidote. How do we become better critical thinkers?
Well, Kita argues that the key is to cultivate intellectual humility.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that we don't have all the answers, that we're prone to biases, and that being wrong is actually part of the learning process.
It's about being open to new information and being willing to change your mind when presented with evidence that challenges your beliefs.
Exactly. And it's about being skeptical, not in a cynical sense, but in a way that demands evidence and critical thinking.
So the next time I'm tempted to believe some shocking headline or some really compelling anecdote, I need to remember all the ways that my own thinking could be leading me astray.
That's the first step. And then you can start applying those tools of critical thinking. Examine the source, look for evidence, consider alternative explanations, and be aware of your own biases.
It's like having this mental checklist to run through before accepting any claim at face value.
Exactly. And remember, it's an ongoing process. We're never going to be perfect critical thinkers, but we can continually improve our skills.
Well, this deep dive into don't believe everything you think has definitely given me a lot to think about.
I'm glad to hear it. And hopefully it'll inspire you to keep exploring this fascinating world of critical thinking. There are so many great resources out there, from books to podcasts to online courses.
Yeah, it's a journey worth taking, especially in a world where we're just bombarded with information from all sides.
Absolutely. By becoming more aware of how our minds work and the ways in which we can be misled, we can make more informed decisions, have more productive conversations, and ultimately live more fulfilling lives.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me and for sharing your insights on this really important topic.
It was my pleasure. And remember, the next time you encounter some extraordinary claim, don't believe everything you think, demand evidence, think critically, and stay curious.